I fly Tinywhoops. This is my favorite. It's the Air 65 from BetaFPV, and it's analog, so I typically have to fly with an analog module or my HD0 goggles. But normally I fly my bigger quads with DJI. For the last 2 months, I've been flying this, which is the BetaFPV Meteor 75 Pro with DJI O4. So this is going to be in depth of what this is like to live with as a Tinywhoop.
Hi, Editing Gareth here from the future, and before I go into more detail about what this is like, I wanted to travel back to 2 months ago when I first got this quad, and I filmed myself making some guesses about what I thought this was going to be like. I was going to cut this out completely to save some time in the video, but I think it's actually relevant for what happens later in the testing. So don't worry, I've edited this down so I get to the point quicker. Just a quick disclaimer, I didn't receive this quad for free. I didn't get this at a discount. I paid for this full price with my own money, and my intention was to buy this, take the parts out of it and put it into a tiny freestyle frame, but I thought I would test this out first, and that's where this video came from. But here's my prediction on what I think this Meteor 75 Pro with the O4 system is gonna fly like. So given the size of this is almost like the Pavo Pico, and it uses the same motors, I think that this is going to be a good cruiser. I think I'm going to be impressed with the look of the O4, which I haven't tried yet. I've only tried the O4 Pro, and this is going to be a major step up for Tinywhoops. The 2023 Mobula 6 HD0 with the dual board was so heavy that it couldn't power loop very well, and I couldn't even use turtle mode. So my prediction for this is that I think it will power loop okay because it's got bigger motors, bigger props. I don't think it's going to be that great. And I'm not entirely sure about turtle mode with this, but we'll test all of this in the flight. The only other prediction I'm going to make is that because of the additional weight, I think that these ducts are going to break pretty quickly because of the way that I fly Tinywhoops. Which will be a problem because I didn't order any spare ducts or a spare canopy, so if it breaks, it's kind of done until I can get a new one. So let's get this outside, and I'm going to show you my first flight. Of course, I'm not going to fly this just for today and then try and do a full review on it. So I'm going to fly this as much as I can over the next couple of weeks, assuming that I don't hate the first flight that much and assuming that I don't break it in this first outing. Let's get the elephant in the room out of the way first before I talk about how this flies. Let's talk about Jello. This is the first flight of this straight out of the box, and immediately you can see Jello. And I'm really taking it easy on this very first flight, as I do the first time I fly everything, just because I don't want to break it on the first go and then not be able to do more with the video. And as bad as the Jello is here for a brand new quad, after I started to throw this around a little bit more, started to crash it a little bit, the Jello got really bad at one point that it made it almost impossible to fly. And as it turns out, the self-tapping screws that hold the canopy to the ducts aren't really long enough. And this tore out the plastic center that was holding the screw in, so the canopy just started flapping around. As I said, I didn't have a spare duct at this point, so in order to fix this, I just kind of tightened the screws down a little bit more, and it held for about 2 months, but it didn't fix the Jello. I ended up changing the PWM frequency to 48 kHz and swapped the inner part of the canopy for a 3D printed one by TC Moore, and I'll drop a link to those 3D prints below. That helped. It's still not perfect, but it's good enough for me to enjoy flying. And I will try the other part of that canopy in the near future too, just to see how much of a difference that makes. But for the time being, I wanted to keep this canopy on there because we'll come on to the durability in a bit, but this thing did take a beating. Over the last 2 months, I've realized how sensitive this setup is. If the props get slightly chipped, Jello. Tiny bit of grass in the ducts, Jello. Screws too tight, Jello. Screws too loose, Jello. If you look at this the wrong way before you plug it in, you get Jello. And when the ducts break, which they will in every Tinywhoop, you will know instantly because the Jello becomes even worse. If you are thinking about using this for capturing clean cinematic type footage, yeah, this just isn't the quad. The Jello's just too much and you can't stabilize this in gyroflow either. And I was thinking maybe this is a DJI problem because the O4 is notorious for that Jello in lots of different frames. However, I did build this tiny trainer using an O4 and I just kind of jammed this camera TPU mount in there. And honestly, it is still not perfect, but it is handling it a lot better than the Tinywhoop. Now, about durability, I originally thought that this would probably last maybe 3 to 5 packs tops,
considering the extra weight, and then I would have kind of broken it. But I have to admit, I've been kind of impressed. Yes, the screw mounts broke early on, but weirdly they've been fine since, even after a lot of crashes. So the duct broke for the first time after about 25 packs, and that was from smashing it into concrete, so you know, fair enough, this would have happened probably with most Tinywhoop frames anyway. I glued it back together and it broke again, and I keep gluing this back and it keeps kind of breaking in the same spot, so that's not really an issue. But eventually I wrapped this in heat shrink, and shout out to Kelky FPV for that tip. Yes, it's a bit of additional weight, but it's actually held this up a lot better. I've probably put maybe 300-ish packs through this, and eventually I had to change the ducts to a new set of ducts because of the screw mount problem, and I wanted to see if that would fix the Jello anyway. So let's come on to the canopy. This canopy is battered and scuffed all over, but it's still in one piece, which is pretty impressive. The motors and AIO are still holding strong with no issues. As for the DJI O4 unit though, it's probably seen better days. The bind button has gone. It clean broke off at some point when I crashed this. I don't even know when this happened, but I know that it was quite early on. One corner of the board has also snapped off with a gummies mount as well, but it still works, so not a problem. I've even crashed this into wet grass a few times, and I completely lost video, and I thought I'd fried my O4 Air unit. However, I let it dry out, and then it's just come back to life, so it's not as fragile as I thought it was going to be. So yeah, for a whoop I've flown this hard, it's held up surprisingly well so far. Let's talk about how this thing flies. One of my biggest worries about this was how heavy this thing is. And you can feel the weight of this, especially if you're coming from a lightweight analog whoop. You'll notice it, but it's not like it flies like a brick. It actually feels pretty good. Going in, I thought that this was going to be much more of a cruiser, a bit like the Pavo Pico that I flew last year. And it can be if you don't care about getting cinematic footage or perfect video. If you do want that, then I would still go with either the Pavo Pico or maybe the Pavo 20 Pro. Cruising around gives you about 4 to 5 minutes of battery, but if you start throwing this around a little bit more, you get about 2.5 to 3 minutes. And that's the thing, unlike the Pavo Pico, this is not just for cruising. I went back to the UK and I flew this in a forest with the Harlow FPV group. Shout out to those legends for making me feel really welcome that day. And this thing was amazing. The O4 gave me so much more confidence than I've ever had flying analog in this kind of wooded environment. The other weird thing is that penetration and range were so good that you could fly this quite far away, and that just didn't feel normal for a whoop to do. And because of that video quality, I didn't have to worry about ghost branches as much, and I say as much because I still hit a few, but that's more to do with my flying, to be honest. Let's come on to freestyling. Honestly, this is better than I expected. You can throw it up in the air and fling it around. It slides through corners nicely. It feels fun to fly. And it definitely has the power to do tricks, even power loops, which was one thing that I was thinking this wasn't going to be able to do. But it's just a little bit unpredictable. It feels like there's a tiny window of throttle to catch it cleanly off tricks. And if you miss it, you either hit the ground or you overshoot the throttle and look like you chickened out. It does get affected by wind because it is still pretty lightweight, but then all Tinywhoops suffer with the same thing. And this feels big in small spaces. You'll feel this size compared to a 65mm whoop, especially if you're flying this indoors. And I do want to mention the field of view because this is something that people keep talking about with the new DJI O4 Lite. Yeah, it's narrow, but honestly, I didn't notice this at first. And it wasn't until I started doing more proximity flying that I started to notice this more and more. It just makes those tight gaps much tougher to get through on the first try. So yeah, I've gone back and forth on this quad for the last 2 months. I've recorded this video, re-recorded this video, changed my mind about this, changed it back again. And in all honesty, I actually bought this with the intention of taking the parts out of this and moving this to a different freestyle frame. But since then, I've just kept flying it. This has been to other countries with me when I travel. I take it with me on weekends away. I even often have this in my work bag so that if I get time before or after work or maybe at lunchtime for a little rip around, I can do that very easily. It's always been with me over the last couple of months. The weirdest part is that having a Tinywhoop with O4 and ELRS means that you can actually fly quite far.
which just feels wrong. This tiny little thing, but suddenly you're like 300 to 500 meters out like it's nothing, you've got perfect video still. Doesn't make sense. And yeah, it's a little bit bashed up. I ended up fixing this with glue and heat shrink. But what I will say is that if you do want clean footage, then skip this. This is just gonna be highly frustrating for you. But weirdly, I don't really notice the Jello as much as I did originally, because the image that I get is still better than with analog and I can still fly further. So after flying this for 2 months, here's who I think that this quad is aimed at. If like me, you came into the hobby with the DJI system and always wanted to see what a Tinywhoop was like, but didn't want to buy another set of analog or HD0 goggles to try it, this is actually perfect. It will give you a really good understanding of the world of Tinywhoops before you invest in a more proper Tinywhoop and another system. This is also good for people that fly other DJI quads, and you also want to bring a whoop, but it means you have to carry 2 sets of goggles. This is a really convenient solution for keeping that gear to a minimum. But it's also for those DJI pilots that want to fly without drawing too much attention, as you can almost forget that you're flying a Tinywhoop because of that image quality. But here's the question, is this going to replace my Air 65 as my favorite Tinywhoop? So this is the first time I'm flying the Air 65 in 2 months, and as soon as I took off, I knew that there is no way that I'm replacing this with the Meteor 75 O4. I don't want to say this, but it feels so much more locked in. It feels so predictable and it is doing exactly what I want it to do. But no hate on the Meteor 75. This is a huge leap in the right direction and a sign of things to come for Tinywhoops. And I'm excited about that. So what do you think? How long is it before we get a Tinywhoop with DJI that flies as well as an analog one?